Okay, this is part two of the history of Alaska Native languages, and this lecture is coming from two sources that you have available to you. One is Alaska Native Languages, Past, Present, and Future, which is actually in your module, and then another one that is on the AlaSchool site, ALASKOOL, is Many Tongues, Ancient Tales. So again, that gives you a really good overview of Alaska Native languages and their status. So what we know is Alaska Native language, or the history of them, can be divided into two time periods, the Russian time period and the American time period. And the Russian years go from 1741 to 1867, and this time period can also be divided into three different phases. So the first one is when we have first contact of the Aleuts by the Russians and the fur trade starting. So we know that during this time period the Aleut population was reduced from about 16,000 to 1,600 people, and obviously during this time of decimation and fur hunting, no one was interested in the languages at all. And then you had from 1785 to 1825, and this is when the Russians really settled in. They had the establishment of the Russian-American Company, which was for fur trading on Kodiak Island. They had Ross Colony in California, and during this time the Alutiiq people, which are the people of the Kodiak region and the Alaska Peninsula, were reduced from about 10,000 to 3,000. So again, there was a lot of enslavement. Again, no one was interested in learning or doing anything with Alaska Native languages. But then from 1825 to 1865, you have some changes going on. So by this time, the Russian Orthodox missionaries were coming in, and a very famous one that you're going to hear a lot about throughout this class is Father Vinominov. So Father Vinominov came to Alaska in about the 1840s, and he's really important in relation to languages because he's the first one, along with an Aleut chief named Ivan Pankow, who actually took an Alaska Native language and put it down on paper. So he translated it into the Cyrillic alphabet, which is what the Russians used, and had the first Alaska Native language text, which of course was a catechism. And after that, he worked with other regions to try to start getting their languages written down. So this is a really, really big step. And so little by little, also though, what was going on is, of course, the Russians were making people learn Russian, because if you wanted a job by this time, by 1825, you had about 80 years of conquest already. And the game was depleted, so in order to get a job, people had to work in the fur trade or work for the Russians, and they had to know Russian. So we didn't see a whole lot going on with language except for, like I said, these translations, which were great. Then you have the American period. So we know that the United States bought Alaska in 1867. So when Alaska was first bought, no one was interested in the languages. There wasn't a lot of interference, but understand that even during this time, the Russians had a lot of influence still, and it was probably a period of neglect and the least harmful as far as the Americans were concerned. Here's a picture of Seward, by the way. Okay, in 1887 to 1910, you had a lot of changes going on. So you had intense development in mining and canneries. Missionaries came, meaning the American missionaries, And Sheldon Jackson, who was also a missionary, became Commissioner of Education. And the whole crux of the United States view towards Alaska Native languages was to totally annihilate them because they felt that everybody should learn English. And to give you an idea of the times, I'm just going to read you a statement that a clergyman wrote in 1880 who was assigned to translate some of these languages into, or translate the Bible into some of the native languages. So this is his quote. "One strong stand, which so far as I know I was the first to take, was the determination to do no translating into the Tlingit language or any other of the Alaska Native dialects of that region. When I learned the inadequacy of these languages to express Christian thought, and when I realized that the whites were coming, that schools would come, that the task of making an English-speaking race of these natives was much easier than the task of making a civilized and Christian language out of the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian, I wrote to the mission board that the duty to which they had assigned me of translating the Bible into these languages and making a dictionary and a grammar was not appropriate and even a harmful task, and that we should let the old tongues with their superstitions and sin die, the sooner the better, and replace these languages with that of Christian civilization, and compel the natives in all our schools to talk English and English only. Thus we would soon have an intelligent people who would be qualified to be Christian citizens. The board moved at first slowly and afterwards strongly in the direction of this recommendation. They relieved me from finishing the task that I had begun of translating the Bible. Our ideas were adopted in other missions. When the Sitka Training School, afterwards called the Sheldon Jackson Institute, was built, English was the only language used on the premises, and always at Fort Wrangell from the first, we had made and enforced this rule. To our stand in this regard, more than to any other, one thing is due, I believe, the exceptional progress of the southeastern Alaska natives into civilization." And so Krauss, in his article, quotes that quote, and then he says, "Young voices very well hear the thinking of these founders of the Alaska educational system concerning a native language policy for the territory." Okay, so I think you get the picture here that it was English, English only, and the American churches and missions were really bad about this. From about 1887 to 1910, you had a really tragic turning point for Alaska Native education. And during this time, again, we had the melting pot theory, but the idea was to take all the Alaska Natives and make them into Anglo-Saxon Protestant people. Here you have a picture of a teacher in the village of Wales about to hit her students for speaking their native tongue. So understand that in most of these schools, they forbade all the speaking of Alaska Native languages. Kids were hit. Their mouths were washed out with soap. The parents were told not to speak to their children in their native tongues because it would deter their educational development. So we had a lot of really, really bad things happening in terms of Alaska Native languages during that time period. So here's some pictures, and you can see what you'll see as we go through the history. The whole point of the Alaska Native educational system, especially back then, was total assimilation, annihilation of tribal native ways, and to make them look and act and speak just like us, meaning Europeans. Okay, so from 1910 to 1960, you had a deadly silence over Alaska Native languages. And it was a period of complete suppression. Again, very anti-native language policy. Kids were beaten up. Parents were told, again, you can't speak your native language. It was during this time that kids were sent outside to a lot of the boarding schools. And again, the native language policy or anti-native language policy was in full force and effect. So students could not speak their native tongue. And you have, from the 1900s to the 1970s, you had schoolhouses built in larger communities. These were BIA, meaning Bureau of Indian Affairs schools. And they undermined the personal, linguistic, and cultural identity of children. Kids were separated from their families. If they wanted to get an education, they were sent away. Language, they were made to speak English, which to a lot of them was incomprehensible. And so a lot of them learned kind of like a mixture of village English. And, this was a bad time. Here's a picture of Tatalik School, Port Clarence. So it wasn't until the 1960s when we had a lot of the other civil rights and human rights issues going on, the rise of black minorities in the rest of the United States. So little by little, there was legislation passed that led to the rebirth of Alaska Native Languages. So in 1970, the BIA persuaded some schools to experiment with bilingual education. 1972, the Alaska legislature passed a set of bills on behalf of Alaska Native Languages. The first one says that Alaska was one of the first states to require children to be introduced to education in their native language if English was not their first language. And every school having 15 kids or more whose dominant language was other than English had to have at least one teacher in that school fluent in the language. The second bill actually started the Alaska Native Language Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So if you go to the Alaska Native Language Center, you can look up the current status of how many Alaska Native language speakers there actually are. So here's what we just talked about. And here's some of the old stats. So it talked about the population, the number of speakers. This is from about 15, 20 years ago. So my guess is the languages are even doing worse. You just look at these and you can look them up. And so these are part of your assignments. Again, these come right from the Alaska Native Language Center, so you could look these up on your own. How do you spell the name Athabaskan? What's the proper term to call the people of the Aleutians? Here's one on Alutiiq and Sugpiaq. You can read through these on your own. So we're not going to have a lot of time to talk about the boarding school experience for Alaska Natives, but again, just understand, for a lot of kids it was pretty horrific because they were shipped all over the country, and a lot of times the parents didn't even know where they were. So this is kind of interesting. In 1976, the state agreed to establish high school programs in every rural village where there was an elementary school, unless the community didn't want a program. So this is called the Molly Hooch Act. And again, I'm going to post something on Blackboard for you to look at about that. And so by the 1980s, boarding school programs were phased out. Today there are 3, Mount Edgecombe and Sitka, and smaller schools in Galena and Nenana. Here's some of the ones, and you could see some of them were sent outside to Oklahoma, Salem, Oregon, all over the country. And there's a picture of Michael Kraus, who started the Alaska Native Language Center.